Hello, Awaken. My name is Dayl, and today I'm going to be teaching about servant leadership found in the books of Ruth and Esther. So we're going to start with Ruth because that one comes first. But basically, just kind of the background on Ruth. She was married into a Israelite family. She was not an Israelite herself, but she was from a tribe, the Moabites, that were hated by the Israelites, and that will be really important later. And by later, I mean like in 2 minutes. So basically, Ruth was married into this family, and her husband, her brother-in-law, and her father died. How did they die? It does not say. So Ruth was a widow, her sister-in-law was a widow, and her mother-in-law was a widow. And during these times, women, if their husbands died, they would go back to their birth family. But after they passed away, Naomi, who was her mother-in-law, was going to go back to where she was from, her village, and she told Ruth and her sister Orpah, go home, don't come with me, you don't owe me anything, like just leave. And Orpah and Ruth were both like, no, we're going to stay. And then Naomi was like, for real, guys, get out of here. And Orpah left. But Ruth in chapter 1, verse 16 said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem, which is where Naomi was from, and Naomi told her relatives, her friends, like everybody she was coming home to call her Mara, which means bitterness, and she was just very sad, and she said, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. And she goes on to say how everything was taken away from her. So when they got back to Bethlehem, they needed to find a way to get some food. And there was this thing back then called gleaning, where women and orphans, just people who didn't have a man to provide for them, could go to these fields and they could pick up any of the grain or the food that was left behind by the men who were harvesting. So Ruth goes and she tells Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I find favor. So after she says this, she goes to this field that belongs to a man named Boaz. It doesn't say that she knew who Boaz was, but it turns out that Boaz was a relative of Naomi, and he saw Ruth and he found favor in her just as she had found favor in him. And he asked the people in the field, hey, who is that? And then he found out, oh, that's Ruth. She came with Naomi. And he said to them, nobody touch her, leave extra food for her, give her water, give her whatever she needs. And he dealt very kindly with her. And when Ruth goes home to Naomi, she tells her whose field she was in. And Naomi knows. She knows that Boaz is related to her. And she's just like in shock and awe, very happy that that's where Ruth ended up. And eventually throughout the story, Ruth ends up basically offering herself in marriage to Boaz. And Boaz is a kinsman redeemer, which means he's a family member who can marry Ruth to redeem the family line. And he chooses to do that after a series of events that we won't get into. But the point with all this is that Ruth came into a situation where she knew it was going to be hard. It wasn't going to be favorable for her, but she was faithful to Naomi. And through this series of events, she ends up being elevated by the Lord, elevated by Boaz, and she ends up being in the family line of King David and in the family line of Jesus himself. And so she goes and puts herself into this situation that she didn't have to. She could have gone home, but she chose to serve her mother-in-law, and as a result of that was lifted up. And a passage that made me think of is in Matthew. Towards the end of Matthew, when Jesus is kind of gearing up for the crucifixion and everything that's to come, and before his disciples have figured out what is going on, he says to them, the last will be first and the first will be last. And I think Ruth is a really good example of this, that she humbled herself, and because of that, she was the last and she got to be the first. And then on basically the opposite side of the situation where Ruth lowered herself, here's Esther, who is put into a position of power, and she uses that to serve her people. So brief synopsis of the book of Esther. There's a king, his name is difficult to say, so I'm not going to try, but he has a wife. He calls her, he wants to show her off to all of his men, his advisors, his eunuchs, all these people, and she won't do it. She won't come out. And then he just decides, okay, I'm done with you. You crossed the line, lady. And he gets rid of her. And because of this, he is in want of a queen. So he puts out this decree, and he's trying to bring women in to choose a new wife. And one of these women ends up being Esther. Her uncle Mordecai, they were a Jewish family. He took care of her because both of her parents had passed away. And he told her, hey, you got to get in on this. You should be the queen. She goes and she finds favor with the people there, and people give her, like, it says cosmetics. I don't know what biblical makeup was like, but they gave her stuff to make her more beautiful. And she ends up winning the affection and attention of the king. Once Esther is in her position as the queen, this took over a year for it to happen. Her uncle Mordecai finds out that there are people who are trying to kill the king, and he makes this known to Esther, who in turn makes it known to the king. And it's like written down and stored away, and it becomes really important later. But another man who was in power at the time, his name was Haman. It doesn't say why, but he hated the Jews, and he hated the Israelites. And once he kind of rose in power, he decided he wanted to use that power to destroy all of the Jews. So he just goes for it, and he gets the king to let him do this thing. Reading over it, and even just like being as a kid and hearing this story, it seems like the king didn't pay a whole ton of attention. But yeah, he just lets Haman go do this thing, and Mordecai finds out about it. And he is in sackcloth and ashes, and he's weeping and is, reasonably upset about what's going on. And he begs Esther, go to the king, save your people, do what needs to be done. And she tells him, I'm afraid, I could die if I do that, because there was this law or this custom where if you entered the king's presence without his permission, he could kill you, and likely would, unless he extended his scepter. And that was just the sign of welcome, you can be here. And Esther had not been invited into the king's presence in about a month. So she is telling Mordecai, I can't, I'll die, he'll kill me. And he says to her, do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So she goes to the king, and she enters his presence, and he does not kill her. And she asks him, will you come to a feast? And will Haman come as well? And we'll just eat together. And he goes, and he asks her, what is it that you want? Like anything you want. Up to half of the kingdom, you can have it. And she just asks him to come to dinner again. During this time, Haman is sick of Mordecai, and he decides he wants to kill him sooner. He builds these gallows that he wants to hang Mordecai on. But right as he is about to go to the king to ask if he can hang Mordecai, the king calls Haman to him, and he has remembered this thing that Mordecai has done for him and how he saved his life and discovered this plot against him. And he actually asks Haman, what would you do? What would you have me do to honor someone I hold in high esteem? And Haman thinks it's him, so he gives him this whole list of things. And then he says to Haman, okay, great, now go and do that for Mordecai. So Haman has to lead Mordecai through the street wearing royal robes, and he was seeking to put himself in a position of power and honor and all that. But then he ended up having to do that for Mordecai, and it's just funny. But the second night comes around, Esther has the meal with them again, and I believe it's on the second night that she tells the king, look, Haman is trying to kill my people. I'm a Jew. He's trying to kill my uncle. He's trying to kill all of my people. And this is why I think he didn't pay attention to what's going on. He's furious when he realizes what's going on. And he leaves the room in his anger, but when he comes back in, Haman is begging Esther to spare him. And it says that from the angle, it just looks like he was about to cause her harm. So he immediately tells whoever's around, go hang Haman on the gallows that he built himself. So he goes and he's killed immediately. And then everything works out for the Jews. They're able to plunder the people who are going to harm them. Mordecai becomes an official with the king, and there's peace for the Jews. So in this story, it's, like I said earlier, just the opposite, where Naomi lowered herself and was elevated. Esther was elevated and then lowered herself, and she took this risk to help other people, even though it came at great personal cost to her. And that story reminded me of another story of a woman in the Bible, and it's of Mary. Right when Jesus is born, they take him to the temple, as they did with babies when they were born. And Simeon looks at Mary and says to her, "Behold, this child is appointed for the fall and rising of many in Israel, and for a sign that is opposed. And a sword will pierce through your own soul also, so that thoughts from many hearts may be revealed." So in this moment, Mary is told, what you've been called to is going to hurt you. And, it doesn't say if Esther had such an explicit warning, but it was the same thing for her. To risk her life was horrifying. It was so scary. But she did it, and she did it several times. And there are just many times in our lives and in the lives of others that the things that the Lord asks of us, while they are good, they're going to hurt and they're going to cause us pain. But in the end, it's for his glory, and there's nothing better than that. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose." So that's a promise that we have, and something we can know when we're going through trials. When we're asked to do things that we don't want to do, we can know that these are things that are all coming together for the good of God's people and the good and glory of God.